You're listening to the Bar Business Podcast, where every week your host, Chris Schneider, brings you information, strategies, and news on the bar industry, giving you the competitive edge you need to start working on your bar rather than in your bar.
So in today's episode, we're going to seek to solve one very simple question. And that is, what does a cheeseburger and a domestic draft beer actually cost? And the reason why we're going to spend a whole episode just talking about what does a burger and a beer cost is because this is actually a deceivingly simple question. And unfortunately, it's a question that very few people that own bars or restaurants or in our hospitality at all can answer. And the reason why we can't answer it is because oftentimes we guess at food costs. Oftentimes we are guessing at our beer costs. But part of this conversation is going to point out in a few different places, we'll talk about this. But part of our conversation today is to point out how little tiny differences have huge impacts at scale. And so unless you know what it actually costs, you, as the owner, to produce a burger and a beer, and then charge the correct price for that cost for that burger and that beer, there's no way you can make money. That's just a fact. If you don't know your cost, you can't predict your income, you can't control your income, you cannot make money. And that's where a lot of people in hospitality fail. Because they're pricing based upon what they think they should charge. They're pricing based upon what they think the market should bear, not pricing upon their costs. And to an extent, you do have to price upon what the market will bear. You do have to price upon what everyone else is charging. Sure. But to do that, you still have to know your cost. And maybe the option is not to charge less for your cheeseburger or to have a different cost percentage. Maybe the proper option there is to allow yourself the opportunity to pick a different cheese. If you're using a high-end cheddar that costs 25 cents, well, maybe you could use just standard American cheese that costs 12.5 cents. That can be the difference in the bar business between making money and not making money. And as silly as that sounds, as stupid as it seems that 12.5 cents on a slice of cheese can actually predict failure or success, I promise you it actually does come down to that. Let's go ahead and dive into what does a beer and a burger actually cost. So let's start this first part of the equation with what does a beer cost? And I think when we start talking about cost, the first thing we need to do is talk about the difference between theoretical and actual cost. Theoretical cost is going to be what a beer would cost you in a perfect vacuum. Actual cost is your actual amount that you've spent on beer divided by the actual amount of beer that you've sold, the amount of dollars that you've sold. So if you've sold $100 worth of beer and it cost you $25, your actual beer cost is 25%. Now, theoretical would be, I purchased beer for $100 and I'm going to sell it for $25. So my theoretical is 25%. In a perfect world, our theoretical and actual numbers will be about 2 points apart. You're never going to get to a point where your theoretical and actual actually meet and are the same. Your actual will always be slightly worse than your theoretical. But 2% or so is about where you want to be. A lot of bars and restaurants, their theoretical and actual are not separated by 2%. They're not separated by 5%. It's closer to a 10% difference. And this is something particularly that you see in bars when it comes to liquor. And when it comes to some of the more expensive products bars have behind the bar. Those are where sometimes you see the greatest variances. But again, you want your theoretical cost to be known, and you want it to be specific, and you want your actual cost to be within about 2 percentage points of that theoretical if we're running things properly. So when we start to say, what does a beer cost? The first thing with a beer is, are we serving a draft beer or a bottle beer? Now, bottle beer is pretty easy. You buy a case for $24. There are 24 beers in the case. It costs you $1 a beer. If you want a 20% beer cost, then you sell that bottle of beer for $5. There's very little waste involved because the beer is there. Unless you break a bottle or drop a case, there's really no waste at all. And it's very easy to determine that you spent $1 on that, you're selling it for $5, you have a 20% cost. So bottled beer tends to be pretty easy. But I'll tell you this much, draft beer is not. And people often oversimplify draft beer. But let's dig into this a little bit. So let's say, for our example, where we started, we said you're going to get a pint of domestic beer. So a half barrel of beer, the normal size keg that we all think about, is 15.5 gallons. 15.5 gallons is 1,984 ounces, which if you divide 1,984 by 16, you get 124. So in theory, if we take a $100 keg, a pint of beer is going to cost you 80.5 cents. Now, there's a few problems here. One is that we're assuming when we say that beer costs 80.5 cents, we have just made the assumption that you're actually pulling 1,984 ounces of beer out of that keg. And you're not. Hell, we don't even know if that keg, in all honesty, actually has 1,984 ounces in it. Because I don't know if you've ever watched how they fill beer. You kind of hook a hose up and shoot it in, and then it's full. Well, if any of you have ever filled, a gas can, you would know that, your 5-gallon gas can, you might put 4.9 gallons in it. You might put 5.05 gallons in it. So one thing that's for sure is a 15.5 gallon half barrel, more likely than not, does not actually contain 1,984 ounces. So there's some error here. But let's not worry about that part right now. The other part that we assume when we say that beer costs 80.5 cents for that pint is that we're getting 100% of the beer out of the keg. And let me tell you something, in a perfect world where all your equipment runs properly, all your employees pour properly, your draft system is working 100% efficient, you aren't going to pull exactly 124 pints out of that keg. Just isn't going to happen. So a really, really good keg yield is about 90%. Because you have some head that gets poured out, you have beer that gets in the lines, maybe you're cleaning your beer lines, which you should do, but maybe because you're cleaning those beer lines, you lose some beer. Maybe the beer was 10 ounces short in the keg when they sent it to you. Maybe you spilled a beer. Maybe somebody ordered a Bud Light, but you poured a Miller Lite, and so you just wasted 16 ounces. Things happen. Let's say you get a 90% yield, which is a really good yield, quite frankly, out of draft. Now, that beer doesn't cost you 80.5 cents, it costs you 90 cents. If our goal was to have a 20% draft beer cost, and we calculated off of 80.5 cents as a cost of that pint, we would charge $4 for that beer. But if you calculate off 90 cents as the cost of that pint, you would have to charge $4.50 for that beer. And that's why looking at yield is very important. Because it's literally a 50-cent difference in the price, but will make all the difference in the world on your bottom line. If you were basing it off perfect 100% yield on a perfectly full keg that's perfectly poured all the time, you will lose money. You will not be able to maintain that 20% cost. So you have to charge that $4.50. You have to take out that 10%. And heck, maybe you get really lucky and you don't have 90% yield, you have 96% yield. Great. That's just extra money on the bottom line. But not calculating out that 100% perfect is never what will happen in real life does not allow you to make proper prices. And I think I should point out here too, we're calculating a 90% yield. What happens if your keg box runs a little hot, or you have a long draw system with extremely long lines and you have other waste? What happens if it, rather than being at the top end of what we see bars normally get for yield, you're towards the bottom end? So let's say you have a 75% yield. Well, even now at $4.50 a pint, you now have a cost of 24% instead of 20%. So you have to mitigate all those things that can adjust for you. And we will talk about draft beer in the future for sure, and we'll get really in the weeds about this. But for now, to suffice to say, you need to know what that draft beer costs, and you need to calculate with some margin for human error and for just the reality of serving a beer. Because you will never have 124 pints in a keg. Ever. Not going to happen. Then the other thing we have to look at when we're saying, what does this beer actually cost? Is how much beer are you putting on the glass? And we've been talking about a pint. A pint is 16 ounces. All the math I just gave you is on the basis of 16 ounces. But I want you to do something. A lot of bars get glasses from beer distributors. And I think that's a great way to go. Nothing is better than a free glass. When they break, it doesn't cost you anything. It's a wonderful thing. But is that glass actually 16 ounces? Well, it's not. What you'll find if you start to measure glasses that are pints, some of them are closer to 15, some of them are closer to 17. Some of them are right on 16. But also, you're not filling that beer up to the very lip of the glass. And if it's not up to the lip of the glass, you're not actually getting the full volume. Maybe 16 ounces isn't the right number to work from. Maybe we need to look at how much beer we're actually putting in the glass. It is a minor difference, but when you really get down to finally refining your numbers, to really working on the tiny stuff that is going to make you even more money, once you have everything else refined, that's going to make a difference. That's something worth looking into. Another thing to consider is your glass a glass? Did you buy that glass? Is it a free glass from your distributor? Is it plastic? I know there are a lot of bars out there that like to use plastic, especially if you're in a tourist town, you have a lot of space outside, you have people walking around. We all go plastic. But what does that plastic glass cost you? Is that glass 10 cents? Is it 25 cents? And if it is something like, say, 25 cents, well, now your cost is not 90 cents. Your cost is $1.15. And that is a huge, huge difference. If we go back to the example of 75% yield, a difference of 15% in cost is a difference of 7.5 cents. If that glass cost you 15 cents, then what we're really talking about here is a cost difference of 8%. So you have to factor that in. And a lot of people don't ever look at what does my glassware cost me? How does that affect what I'm serving? But you have to. You really do to optimize your numbers. Remember, all of this is to say that if you don't want to do any of this, that's fine. Can you still be successful? Absolutely. But most restaurants make 5%. Most bars make a little bit more than that, probably in the 8 to 10% range. There's less data there, but let's just call it 8 to 10%. A really good operator makes 18, 20, 25%. The difference between the guy that makes 8% and the guy that makes 18% is thinking about things like, what does the plastic glass that I pour this beer into actually cost me? And another thing that is worth thinking about, and it is not traditionally part of beer cost, and I wouldn't even put it in part of beer cost, but what does that labor cost you to pour that beer? There's a bar I like to go to that is a great bar, and they turned some old horse stables into the bar, so it's kind of a cool location. But the thing is that because they used old horse stables, behind their bar, their back bar and to the front counter of the bar, it's probably 10, 12 feet. So it's about 3 times as wide as any other bar I've ever seen in my life. Well, that means that bartender now has to walk 10 feet to get the glass, 10 feet back to the bar to pour the beer. And this happens to be quite a long bar. So if I'm 50 feet from that beer, that bartender is walking 100 plus feet just to pour a beer and hand it to me. That's not efficient. That labor costs money. And a good way to always think about labor and how labor impacts your food and liquor cost is that every step is time and time is money. So it's not really factored into the cost. But anytime you're thinking about what something costs you, you need to consider the incremental labor involved in the creation of that product and the pouring of that beer. So again, what does a draft beer cost? Very simple question. But I hope now you realize it's a very complex answer. And so now let's talk about what does a burger cost? And unfortunately for us, what does a cheeseburger cost is a much more difficult question than what does a beer cost. A beer, we have one ingredient. We're pouring out of one thing. It's a process that, for all intents and purposes, unless we're looking at the example I just gave where we have bartenders walking in circles, it's a pretty quick process. It's a pretty easy process. Now, if we're serving a cheeseburger with fries, that's a much more complex process. The main thing we have to remember when we start to look at food cost is that every little ingredient you use actually costs money. So that means that if we're making a burger, a cheeseburger in this case, with fries, we need to calculate how much the lettuce, tomato, and onion costs. We need to calculate how much the mayo costs, how much the ketchup costs. Everything costs something. And so as we talk about this burger, let's define what we're actually serving here. So we're going to serve a cheeseburger with fries. We have ground beef, cheese, a bun, lettuce, tomato, onion, mayo on our burger. We're going to have a side of fries. And then with those fries, probably the person eating it's going to have some ketchup. So let's start looking at what all of that costs. And I know, especially given the inflation today, a lot of us have gotten used to a lot higher costs. And many bars and restaurants, our costs have gone up, but we have not raised our prices. Because at the end of this calculation, not to skip to the end, but at the end of this calculation, I came up with a food cost of 28% means that you should charge $14.25 for this burger in this hypothetical scenario. And my numbers aren't far off. A $14 burger is a hard sell some places. So we need to look at quantities. We need to look at what we're including, what we're not including. We need to look at everything we can to try to control our costs. Because to have a 28% food cost, which for most bars is a very nice goal to have, your total cost for that burger cannot exceed $4. With the fries, with everything included, it's a $4 cost. And then you have to sell it for $14.25. So maybe you offer smaller burgers. Maybe you cut down on the fries a little bit. Maybe you buy cheaper cheese as opposed to more expensive cheese. But just know that if you're giving away food at a 50% cost or a 60% cost, and it is not a structured loss leader made to bring people in on a slow night of the week, that's not very sustainable. You have to charge what you need to charge for your food. Or you have to look at doing different food so that you can charge appropriately for what you're serving. If you can't charge appropriately for what you're serving, you cannot make enough money to make good money. And you'll have issues putting money on your bottom line, and you won't put as much in your pocket as you should be. But let's get back to what this burger costs. So if we're looking at everything that goes into a burger, first thing we have to look at, and the thing that's going to cost the most money, is obviously the beef. And so ground beef right now, let's call it $4.60 a pound. I personally think bars should do 8-ounce burgers. A lot of people do 6. You can do 6. You could do 2 3-ounce patties. There's a lot of different things you can do. But I have found in my experience, at least in the Midwest, an 8-ounce burger is going to give people a burger that they look at and they go, oh my God, that's huge. They worry a little bit less about price, and they're very happy with the product. But you can do it however you want. But let's base this on an 8-ounce burger. So if we're paying $4.60 a pound, we're doing an 8-ounce burger, that meat's costing us $2.30. We have to put that burger on a bun. And let's say we don't do a particularly high-end bun, that's going to cost us 75 cents. Now, it's a cheeseburger, so we're going to have to put cheese on it. And this is one of those places where you have so many options available to you And you need to think about what you're doing. A lot of bars will give customers the choice of cheese, which is fine. But if a slice of American cheese costs 12.5 cents and a slice of cheddar cheese costs 25 cents, you need to base everything on the cheddar cheese price. Make extra money when they order American and base everything on the cheddar. Any component that you allow a customer to choose which option they want, your pricing should always be based off the highest cost option. Otherwise, people will realize they're getting a good deal and you'll lose your ass. And you say, well, how does 12.5 cents on a piece of cheese really hurt me? Well, if it's 12.5 cents that should be on your bottom line that's not, and you do that 1,000 times, that's $125. And if you do that 1,000 times a month, it's $1,500, $1,600. That's good money in your pocket. So will 12.5 cents make or break you? No, but do you have to worry about 12.5 cents constantly with everything you do to ensure that you're maximizing your bottom line? Yes. So anyway, that cheese costs 12.5 cents. Actually, we're going to base this off the cheddar, right? Because that's the more expensive one. Costs 25 cents. For sake of argument here, let's say that our lettuce, tomato, and onion cost 20 cents. Our fries, we do a 7-ounce serving of fries, cost us 40 cents. And then condiments, salt, pepper, all that just kind of associated stuff, we'll call that another dime. So that gives us a total cost of $4. Nothing fancy, nothing extravagant, nothing hugely labor intensive to this. But again, at a 28% food cost, that means we have to charge $14.25 for this burger. You start talking about sauteed mushrooms, sauteed onions. Well, you're going to have to push way above that $14.25 to keep 28% food cost. So you really have to think about every single bit of this. And something that I have to mention while we're discussing this is that you must portion everything. A, it's a consistency issue. You want to give a consistent product always. But let's say we added an extra ounce of fries. We would have to add a quarter to our price in order to make up for that extra ounce of fries. So a 7-ounce fry, $14.25, and 8 ounces of fries, we now have to charge $14.50 to maintain the same cost percentage. And fries sound like this tiny little thing, but you really do need to portion them. You really do need to make sure that burger, if we're basing it on an 8-ounce burger, well, if you're serving 9-ounce burgers because those aren't being weighed out, those aren't being properly portioned, oh my God, you're not going to make near the cost percentage you should. And again, just like with the liquor and the beer, you have an actual cost and a theoretical cost. And we really do want these within a couple points of each other. Because if your theoretical is 28 and your actual is 38, your kitchen's losing money. You need your theoretical to be 28 and your actual to be maybe 29, 30, but you need to be darn close if you want to make money and if you want to be successful. You really do have to count pennies. And when it comes to the kitchen, the other thing we have to think about, just like I was talking about with front of house and labor and how many steps are involved, labor to produce something in the kitchen is significant. To make a burger end to end, if we just count the time your cook is actively working on making that burger, that might be 5-10 minutes. And for sake of argument, let's just say that the total active time on making that burger was 6 minutes, so 1/10 of an hour, and that your cook got paid $15 an hour. Well, the labor then for that burger is $1.50. So you know out of that $14.25, not only do we have to have a 20% food cost, but we have to cover that labor. And that's why in the restaurant business, you have to be very careful about these costs and their prices. You can't just price food, particularly today with all the inflation. You cannot price food only based off what your competitors charge. You cannot base food off of what you think a burger should cost, what you want to pay for a burger when you go out. You have to price your food directly off your costs and maintain your margins in order to maintain a profit. Now, to some extent, we might want to have a conversation about, well, inflation is rampant. I was charging $12 for this burger. I don't think I should charge $14.25. I'm willing to make a little bit less money. I'll charge $13.25. I'll go from $12 to $13.25, and then I plan to go up to $14.25 down the road. Okay, fine. You can eat into your own pocket for a little bit that way. But between me and you, if you are the owner of the bar and you are relying on this as your income source, what you do with your life depends upon how much money you make. You're not going to want to do that very long. You're not going to be the best you can be if you're having to cut costs at home to make up for what you're not making at the bar because you're not charging what you need to charge. To answer the question that we started this episode with, what does a beer and a burger actually cost? Based on the numbers we've discussed, our answer would be $4.90. And for that $4.90 in cost, in order to have the right margins, you would basically need to charge $18.75. Maybe that seems high, maybe it doesn't. It's going to depend on your market. But just know, percentages don't change. It doesn't matter what your market is. And one other note here about what this actually costs. I know in a lot of bars, and I did this, we like numbers that end on a quarter, and we don't like to add sales tax to receipts. Right? If we're charging $4.50 for a beer, we want to just get $4.50 from that guest. So you also have to factor in, after you factor in your cost and your theoretical and actual percentages, you've got to factor in sales tax. Because if you're charging $4.50 for a beer, because your cost on that beer is 90 cents, and that gives you a 20% cost, theoretical, but your jurisdiction where you live has a 10% sales tax, well, you're off a little bit. So if you're going to charge 10%, that beer that's $4.50 is a lot more like $5 or $4.95. To actually add that back in so that at the end of the day, you're not eating what you're paying the state, what you're paying the county, what you're paying the city in sales tax. So you have to factor sales tax in as well if you don't intend to add sales tax at the end to your bills. And sometimes you will want to, sometimes you won't want to. It's going to depend on your concept. It's going to depend on how you look at things. But if you're not adding sales tax in, you absolutely must remember sales tax and add it appropriately, depending upon how you're charging people. To wrap this all up, the bottom line here is that without knowing your very specific costs, you cannot price properly. And if you cannot price properly, you cannot determine the actual theoretical cost of everything you sell. If you can't determine the theoretical cost, you can't price. And if you can't price properly, you cannot put the right amount of money in your pocket. Because the difference between someone that is marginally successful and greatly successful is paying attention to the small percentage points that exist in the bar business.
Thanks for listening to the Bar Business Podcast. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Check out our website at barbusinesspodcast.com and join our Bar Business Nation Facebook group for more strategies and tips.